Okay, we ready? I guess. I'll start, and I assume we're ready. I'm Barbara Salzman, and I'm the president of Marin Audubon Society, and I wanted to welcome you all tonight to our special program on the Fish and Wildlife Services plan to eradicate introduced house mice from the Farallon Islands. For 75 years or more, Marin Audubon has worked to protect wildlife and their habitat. And we're honored to host this program this evening in keeping with that tradition. There's been quite a bit of misunderstanding and misinformation spread around about this project. Tonight, you'll hear from 4 scientists who love the islands. They've worked on them. Somebody estimated for 150 years total. And some of them have lived on the islands. They've studied its wildlife. They studied the introduced species, the ecosystem, and they know the impacts that these introduced species are having. And all of that information has contributed to the preparation of the plan, as along with all of the background from the many other eradications that have taken place throughout the world. Their information will correct the misinformation, and they'll explain about the eradication plan and the need to implement it. The facts you will hear will also prepare you to comment to the Coastal Commission when they hold their hearings on this project later this year. Before I introduce Anna Weinstein, who's going to be our Master of Ceremonies, I wanted to spend a moment looking at the, yes, there it is, 31 organizations who are now in support of this project. And I wanted to make special note of 2 categories of organizations. One is the science organizations, and I think hard to pick them out with so much busyness, but Point Blue, which has certainly been a strong supporter, and the California Academy of Science. And also the wildlife rehabilitation organizations, and they include the Oiled Wildlife Care Network and International Bird Rescue. Their support is a clear indication. All of these supporting organizations present a clear picture of the importance of this plan and of implementing it. Now I'm pleased to turn over the microphone, so to speak, to Anna Weinstein, who is the Marine Conservation Director for National Audubon Society, and she will be our Master of Ceremonies this evening, and I'll come back and say goodbye later. Take it away, Anna.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thanks to you and to Marin Audubon for everything you've done for people and nature in our area. Thank you very much, and for hosting this event tonight. So yes, I'm Anna Weinstein. I'm the Marine Conservation Director for National Audubon Society, and I really want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us tonight for this event. We're very grateful that you've joined us. The subject tonight is the Farallon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. These public lands are administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The service is your lead federal agency for protecting habitat and species on land and on the coast. This restoration project that you're going to learn about tonight would be a crowning achievement in the service of this mission. In sum, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other technical experts presenting to you tonight will show you, next slide please, that the ecosystem on the Farallon Islands is out of balance, putting the survival of threatened species at risk. A one-time application of rodenticide is the only proven, tested solution that can safely achieve 100% eradication and restore a key ecological site. The research and planning of this project represents a comprehensive, transparent, and scientifically rigorous process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So after this webinar, we're going to provide you with a link you'll see there on your screen. We'll provide it again actually now. We'll provide it again now and then again after the webinar. It'll enable you to go to this link to send a letter to the Coastal Commission. You can send a letter as it is or personalize it. So Coastal Commission staff have already found this project to be 100% consistent with the Coastal Act. Now commissioners need to hear from you to find consistency of the project with the Coastal Act as their staff has recommended to allow the project to move forward successfully. So again, we will show this link, we'll drop it in during the presentations and we'll show it again at the end for you to go. It won't take long and it's very important that the Coastal Commission hears your voice. So just a couple of housekeeping notes now. You've all been, of course, muted to prevent background noise. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentations, but you should enter your questions as you go, as you think of them. You don't need to wait to submit a question. So what you do is you go to the bottom, there's a Q&A tool. You can find it by moving your mouse to the bottom of the screen and selecting Q&A. And we will leave 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to take your questions. We really want to hear your questions. So now I want to present tonight's speakers. Next slide, please. Roger Harris, on your left, is a wildlife biologist with 35 years of experience leading nature trips to the Gulf of the Farallones for the Oceanic Society. He's on the board of the Marin Conservation League, the Conservation Committee of the Marin Audubon Society, and is chair of the Marin County Parks and Open Space Commission. Pete Warzybok is the senior marine ecologist and Farallon program leader. His work focuses on the ecology and conservation of marine ecosystems, overseeing research activities at the Farallones, where he manages long-term data on the population's breeding success, phenology, and diet of marine birds and mammals. Pete started working on the Farallones in 2000 and has spent at least 1,700 nights on the island. Gerry McChesney has dedicated the last 35 years to the conservation and research of coastal and island ecosystems of California. Gerry started as a research intern on the Farallones in 1986. He started with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2002 and became the manager of the Farallon Islands National Wildlife Refuge in 2008. And finally, Dr. Winston Vickers is a wildlife research veterinarian working with the UC Davis Wildlife Health Center and Institute for Wildlife Studies of Arcata, California. He's been a veterinarian for 42 years and has dealt with a wide variety of disease, ecology, and toxin issues of both domestic and wild animals. He has extensive experience with seabirds from his many years serving as a wildlife vet and wildlife hazing director for the Oiled Wildlife Care Network. So with no further ado, I present Roger Harris. Take it away, Roger.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you for the opportunity for all you folks listening in to tell you about what is really my favorite place in the planet. I've done over 300 trips, leading people, nature trips to the Farallones, boat trips, and it never gets old. And the reason why is because going to the Farallones and seeing the Farallones is a window into what the planet may have looked like before our species became the dominant species. Gives you a glimpse into pristine nature. Next, so we want to look at the big picture, which is Pacific Ocean. It's bookended by continents. On the west side, you can see many islands, but on the east side, our side, there's only a very few islands, like the Farallon Islands, that are free of mammalian predators, be they black bears or, for that matter, mice. And these islands are of global importance because they are key seabird nesting islands. Next, the Farallon Islands has the largest seabird colony in the contiguous United States. It supports about 25% of the seabirds in California that are born on those islands. There's some 350 breeding seabirds of 13 species. Next, amongst those 13 species, the one that probably is of most interesting concern is the ashy storm petrel. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, an authoritative group on the endangerment of species, lists the ashy storm petrel as endangered. And the reason why is because the population is only about 10,000 individuals, which is very small for a wild population. Not only that, but the population is concentrated. About half the population is found on the South Farallon Islands. And that makes the bird particularly vulnerable to perturbance, to disturbance, such as an oil spill, but also, as we'll see, to the introduced mice. And next slide, please. The Farallon Islands and the adjacent waters also host an incredible diversity of marine mammals, 36 species in total. Of them, 5 species of seals and sea lions breed on the Farallon Islands. Next. The Farallones is sometimes called the California's Galapagos. And like the Galapagos, the Farallones supports what we call endemic species. Endemic species are species that are found only in a particular place. And in the Farallones, we have a unique salamander and a unique cricket. And the maritime goldfield, which is a native plant, is a near endemic. It's found in a few other offshore islands, but its largest stand is on the South Farallon Island. And these 3 species also are, as we'll see in this presentation, are also at risk from these introduced mice. Next, please. Now, the Farallones has received its share of human abuse. Starting in 1810, there was a harvest of northern fur seals for their valuable pelts. And that harvest ended in 1836 with the local extinction of the fur seals. Next. However, with protection, the seals have returned after almost a century and a half of absence. And now right now on the island, there's over 1,000 pups. And that population is increasing almost exponentially. Next. A similar story can be seen with the northern elephant seal, which was harvested for its blubber, which was rendered into oil. In fact, this animal was thought to have gone extinct range-wide, but it was rediscovered in 1882 in a small remnant colony on the island of Guadalupe off the coast of Baja California. And this animal has received protection, and it has been very successful. It's now nearly at pristine numbers on the island, and as you know, the local residents know, it's also colonizing the Point Reyes Peninsula as well. Next, please. The third restoration success story refers to the common murre, and they were absolutely hammered when the gold rush came to California, and there was a demand for eggs, and the Petaluma chicken farms had not yet started. So what happened was that there was an egging industry that removed some 14 million murre eggs from the Farallon Islands. The population went from an estimated 1 million species, individuals, down to a mere 6,000. And that was in about the 1950s. The population was hammered not only by the egging, which ended in 1904, but also by oil spills. However, under protection, particularly from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, when they took over administration of the Farallon Islands, this species has really expanded. There's over 250,000 common murres nesting on the Farallon Islands, and this is the largest common murre nesting colony in the contiguous United States. Next. The lighthouse keepers brought in European hares, and they were implicated in the local extinction of the rhinoceros auklet, which is another seabird that nests in burrows, and was thought that the bunnies destroy their nesting burrows. Next, however, the rabbits were exterminated by 1974, excuse me, and the rhinoceros auklets shortly returned. And not only did the rhinoceros auklets return, but the iconic bird of the Farallones, the tufted puffin, which was hanging in there in low numbers, started to increase their populations with the extermination of the rabbits. Next. So that brings us to the possibility of restoration success story number 5. Next. And here we address the last remaining introduced mammalian predator on the island, which is the house mouse. These were accidentally introduced to the island, and because they didn't have the usual checks and balances that a natural population would have, the population expands greatly in the wet season when there's lots of green vegetation to eat. But in the dry season, when the vegetation dries out, the population crashes next. And what happens is the mice start to cannibalize each other and die a slow death. And I apologize for these very unappealing slides, but it tells a natural story. The second picture, in the lower part of this panel, is another phenomenon that has not yet been detected on the Farallones, but has happened on other islands where mice have been introduced. And this is where the mice attack nesting seabirds and eat their flesh. They gnaw on the living bird. And this is because the seabirds have evolved without such a mammalian predator on the island. And so their natural instinct is to, when they're attacked, is to hunker down in the nest. Of course, that doesn't help them avoid mice. Next slide, please. So the Farallones has some very big problems, but also has a very big solution. And I'm very honored to be part of this panel with people who have absolutely dedicated their lives to the preservation and protection of the islands. And next speaker, Peter Warzybok, is probably second to none in terms of a person dedicated to the Farallon Islands. And
Thank you so much, Roger, for so well illuminating how sensitive this system is, yet how responsive it is to release from threats and restoration efforts. So next, Pete Warzybok, Senior Marine Ecologist and Farallon Program Leader for Point Blue, who will share a window into this island.
Oh, thank you, Anna, and thank you very much, Roger, for that wonderful introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Pete Warzybok with Point Blue Conservation Science, and the Farallon Islands are a very, very special place for me. I have lived and worked on the Farallon Islands for the last 20 years, and I hold the distinction of having spent more nights on the islands than any other person in modern history. And so not only are the islands an incredibly special place for the wildlife that breeds out there, but in many ways, they're also my home. And I care about them very passionately, and I'm very dedicated to making sure that what we're doing is for the benefit of the refuge and for its unique and wonderful wildlife. And so Point Blue also has been on the islands even longer than I have. Biologists from Point Blue have been going out to the Farallones every single day since April 3rd of 1968. And that gives us this incredible long-term perspective and deep understanding of the ecology of the islands. With more than 50 years of data, we're able to see how things change over time. And we're able to really document the impact that these invasive mice are having on the island. And so tonight, my role is to talk to you a little bit about some of the science that goes into supporting this restoration. Next slide, please. So house mice and invasive mammals in general are among the greatest threats to island ecosystems across the world. On the Farallones specifically, house mice have multiple direct and indirect impacts on the native species, as illustrated in this graphic. Mice have caused predation pressure on some of our native endemic species, such as the Farallon camel cricket and the salamander. They eat the native vegetation, and they also have negative impacts on storm petrels through indirect. The presence of mice also reduces other species' resiliency to ecological stressors. So those native species are less able to adapt to other changes in the environment. Next slide, please. So here what we're looking at are some of the direct impacts that these mice are having. And on the right side is a simple pie chart showing the diet proportion of mice. So this is basically a breakdown of what they're eating. And it's clear from this analysis that mice are having an impact on a wide variety of the native species on the island. Much of their diet consists of plant matter, mostly that native vegetation, the Licinia seeds. They also impact the insects on the island, inverts, including that endemic cricket. Salamanders and seabirds also make up a major proportion of the diet. So it's clear by just looking at what mice are eating that they're having a direct impact on these biological resources. But we also know that they're having an indirect impact. And as Roger alluded to earlier, one of the species we're most concerned about is the impact that mice are having on ashy storm petrels. Next slide, please. So what we did is we looked at this relationship between mice, burrowing owls, and ashy storm petrels. And what I'm showing here is the annual cycle of mouse abundance on the islands. Mice numbers are generally low during the summer. They start to build in the fall, peaking in September, October, and then they crash again during the winter when it gets cold and wet on the island. Burrowing owls, which just showed up as the green line on your chart, they show up at the island during the regular fall migration, arriving right when the mice are at their peak. And because there's so much food out there, many of those owls, instead of continuing migration, they decide to stay for the winter and feed on those mice. However, when that mouse population crashes, the owls have to find something else to eat. And that's what this blue line is on the chart that just showed up. So when the mice disappear, the owls have to go and switch to feeding on those storm petrels, which are just returning to the islands to start to set up for their breeding season. And so what you can see is that peak in the blue line shows the tremendous predation pressure that owls are putting on birds, particularly in the late spring or late winter and early spring. And this is a classic example of what's called hyperpredation. It's a phenomenon in ecology where the presence of one prey species, in this case, the introduced mouse, facilitates a severe predation impact on another native prey species, oftentimes a threatened one, as is our ashy storm petrel. Next slide, please. And this predation impact can be huge. And so these pictures are showing you piles of ashy storm petrel carcasses. And again, it's an unappealing image, but these are what we find on the island outside owl roosts during the late winter and early spring. And a single owl can take many, many storm petrels in a very short period of time, leaving piles like this in just a few days. And so even a small number of owls overwintering on the island can have a major predation impact. Next slide, please. So then what we want to do is, knowing that there's this major predation, we want to see, well, how does that affect actual storm petrel populations? So we went back to that long-term data that I talked about earlier, these 50 plus years of data. And so we have long-term data on ashy storm petrels, and we developed population models, and we determined what their population trend is over recent years. And then we projected that out 20 years into the future with everything exactly the same. So mice haven't been removed, owls are still coming to the island and preying on the storm petrels. And these are the results we get in this figure. We see the ashy storm petrel population is likely to decline by 63% over the next 20 years. This is a huge decline in population for a species that has a very small global population, as Roger mentioned. They're limited distribution, and more than half the world's population is here on the Farallones. Next slide, please. But we also were able to model what the benefits of reducing that predation is. So by changing some of the parameters in the model to make that predation pressure lower, we're able to look at, well, if we reduce the predation, what do we see? And those are the orange and green lines you see show up in your figure. That clearly the impact on storm petrel populations is lessened by reducing that owl predation. And if we can achieve 70 to 80% predation reduction by not having those owls overwinter, then we get this green line where the storm petrel population is stable or even increasing in 20 years. So this is a huge population benefit and a huge ecological benefit for the Farallon Islands by removing that. Next slide, please. And so what we're talking about here is breaking that hyperpredation link. Again, by removing those mice, the owls will still come to the island during migration. They'll stop over, but they won't have that huge source of food. So they won't be induced to stay on the island. They'll continue their migration. And then because they're not spending the winter, the predation pressure on the storm petrels is less, their survival is higher, and we see increases in their population size. Next slide, please. Of course, undertaking an eradication project like this certainly has some risks to native species. And one in particular that we were concerned about are Western gulls. So Point Blue and the service partnered up with collaborators who are experts in the field of wildlife hazing to undertake a study to look at the ways that we could reduce the risk specifically to Western gulls from this project. And so experts such as Winston, who's going to be talking later from OWCN and UC Davis, folks from the USDA and Island Conservation help with this study. And the goal was to go out there and reduce the number of gulls that are present on the island and limit their access to areas that would be baited. Next slide, please. And what we found was that the gull hazing was actually extremely effective at keeping gulls away from the island. We have the benefit of the fact that the eradication project will happen during the time of year when gulls are already at their annual minimum, where there's only a few thousand gulls on the island instead of their full breeding population. But even so, after just a few days of hazing, we were able to reduce those numbers to near zero. And we achieved 98% hazing success on a daily basis. So 98% of the gulls that either landed on or even flew close to the island, we were able to keep them away from any areas where we would be putting out bait and during an eradication. And those few birds that did remain were only on the island for short periods of time, typically less than half an hour. And they were in areas out on the periphery of the island, in the intertidal zone or on offshore islets where there are no mice and they aren't likely to be impacted by consuming bait. And so what we've learned from these studies is that mice are clearly having an impact, a direct and indirect impact on the species, the native species on the island. That by removing the mice and therefore the owl predation, we can achieve real positive conservation benefits. And by using sound mitigation measures, we can actually greatly reduce the risk to other non-target species. Next slide, please. And this brings us to our final positive future vision for a restored Farallon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. If we're able to go ahead with this eradication and remove those mice, we expect to see results and benefits to the ecosystem that are similar to other eradications that have been done around the world, more than 700 successful eradications worldwide. As Roger mentioned, the last of those introduced mammal predators will finally be removed from the island. Those native species, such as the ashy storm petrels, the crickets, and the salamanders, will greatly benefit and the threats to them will be reduced. Native vegetation will be able to thrive and flourish once that grazing pressure from the mice is removed. And the Farallon Islands will be restored to a more natural balance. And perhaps maybe most impactful of all, the native species on the island will gain the resiliency necessary to adapt and withstand future stressors, such as climate change, which we know will impact perpetual populations or other native populations, and other stressors that may show up. So by removing that artificial pressure created by the introduced mice, we give them more breathing room to respond and adapt, and we end up with healthy populations long into the future. Thank you very much for listening, and I will turn it back to Anna.
Thank you so much, Pete, for sharing your amazing expertise on our beautiful, elusive little ashy storm petrels and the whole island ecosystem. And so next is Gerry McChesney, who is the Farallon Refuge Manager for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Take it away, Gerry.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you all for joining us. And I especially want to thank the Marin Audubon Society for hosting this great event and for all of their support. So I am going to be providing you the details of what many of you, I'm sure, think is a crazy and impossible idea. But it is a plan that science and history tells us is necessary for the health of the islands and is and can be done successfully. Next slide. So as Anna mentioned earlier, I did start my career on the Farallon Islands. I was a research intern out there during the seabird season in 1986 and again in 1987. And I immediately fell in love with the Farallon Islands and very quickly realized that dedicating my career to the conservation of places like the Farallones and the species that inhabit them was what I wanted to do. And that is what I have spent most of the last 35 years doing. Next slide. So as Roger and Pete have all already kind of hinted on, you know, the problem we have before of us is really part of a global issue. And I think many of us, I'm sure, understand that we are in an age of mass extinction like this planet has never seen before. And of all of these extinctions that are happening in recent times, as well as the majority of the threatened and endangered species that we have, even though islands make up a very small proportion of Earth's landmass, the majority of these extinctions and endangered species occur on islands. And while there are many different things that contribute to that, habitat loss, climate change, invasive species like introduced rats and mice actually contribute to a large majority of those extinctions. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the situation that we have on the Farallon Islands. This is what it looks like on the Farallones when mice are at peak abundance, when we have upwards of about 500 house mice per acre on the islands. This is the highest house mouse densities ever recorded for any island in the world. And when they're out there like this, they're literally everywhere. And it's almost like the ground is moving with mice. They come into our houses. You cannot keep them out. They chew through the doors and the floors. And they eat just about everything, including each other. Seeing them cannibalize one another is not an uncommon thing to see. Next slide, please. Now, you've already seen this graphic before, and as Pete gave us in a lot of detail, you know, the impacts of all of these mice on the island are quite great. And it is our goal as refuge managers to eliminate those impacts and restore the ecosystem from the impacts of mice. Next slide. So in order to accomplish this, we have been going through a very extensive planning process that has now been in process for over 15 years. This goes all the way back to 2004. It's been very comprehensive. It's involved lots of experts, other agencies, considerable public input. And that finally resulted in the publication of an environmental impact statement that we put out in early in 2019, and brings us to where we are now, which is pretty much the late stage of the planning process. Next slide. Now, in undergoing this planning process, the research that went into it was probably the most rigorous and comprehensive to date of any project of its type. And in determining the best method to use to deal with the mouse situation, we wanted to make sure that we left no stone unturned. And we thoroughly considered and vetted all potential options, of which when we finally listed these out was 49 potential alternatives in total. And using this vigorous approach, we used a standardized method to evaluate them and compare them all these options based on many different criteria, things like environmental concerns, logistical concerns, human safety issues, regulatory considerations, and mitigation considerations as far as protecting other resources. And after going through all of these initial analyses, this led us to our final alternatives, 3 different alternatives that were analyzed in detail in the environmental impact statement. Next slide, please. Now it's in the EIS or the environmental impact statement where you fully analyzed the different alternatives that seem to be, you know, have the greatest possibility. And after all of the analyses that were conducted, we came down to a preferred alternative of using a rodenticide known as Predicafoam 25D conservation. And what Predicafoam is this particular formulation. It's a rodenticide that is actually regulated by the EPA, especially for island eradications like the one that we propose on the Farallon Islands. We came to the conclusion that this is the only proven effective method that could actually eradicate the mice from the island. And we also understand that using a rodenticide does come with its inherent risks. And we take that very seriously. And the plan that we have has many measures that are incorporated into that to minimize those environmental side effects. And I'll talk more about those later. Next slide, please. Now, as Pete and Roger also mentioned before, these eradication techniques are not new. And we see the Farallones as also part of a global effort to reduce the impacts of these invasive mammals on islands. There have now been over 700 successful rodent eradications worldwide. Most of those have been with rats. There have been 5 successful eradications in the US. And to date, there are now 59 successful house mouse eradication projects. So we at our point have the benefit of learning from all of these past eradication projects and incorporating all of those lessons learned into the Farallon eradication plan. Next slide, please. And this is just a list of, a few of the hundreds of islands that have now had successful eradication projects done. And I especially want to point out one that was right here in California. That's Anacapa Island. Many of you are probably familiar with that. It's in Channel Islands National Park off of Southern California. And they conducted a rat eradication out there in 2000 and 2001. And it was using the same techniques that we proposed doing with the Farallones. This was a very successful project. And that island is now in a state of recovering from the impacts of introduced rats. Next slide, please. So how do you go about doing a mouse eradication project on the Farallon Islands? Well, it's not something that just anybody can do. This would be a project that would be conducted by highly trained professionals using all of the state-of-the-art techniques that have been developed over the last 40 years of island rodent eradications around the world. And I think one important point is that these are operations that are done over just a matter of weeks, maybe 5 weeks in the case of the Farallon project. These are not projects that go on for months or years or in perpetuity like say rodent control would be. And another important point is just the total amount of rodenticide that would be used. It's actually a very small amount. So most of what is being put out is the rodent bait, which is mostly a cereal grain bait that breaks down very quickly. And the amount of rodenticide in them is actually very small. So it's about 1.6 ounces over the total 120 acres of the island. And what this really means is that it's not like we're putting thousands of pounds of rodenticide on the island. It's actually a very small amount. So you're not leaving, these hundreds or thousands of pounds of rodenticide on the island that would last for years. This is something that would break down over a period of months. Next slide, please. And as I said before, we recognize that we're introducing a rodenticide to the island, and that does come with some inherent risk to it, and we take that very seriously. And so we would want to be absolutely certain that we're taking every measure possible to protect the non-target resources on the island. And this goes into the operations themselves, making sure that bait is placed where we want it and not where we don't want it, like into the marine environment. The timing of the project that Pete mentioned before, this would be done in the fall, outside of the seabird breeding season, outside the marine mammal breeding season, when numbers of birds are actually at their minimum on the island. It's actually a pretty quiet time of year on the island. Pete mentioned the gull hazing program to protect our gull population. That's, basically keeping gulls away from the island so they're not in harm's way. We'd also capture the birds of prey on the island, like the burrowing owls and peregrine falcons, and keep them aside and keep them out of harm's way. We have our endemic salamanders to consider, and studies have shown that they are actually not affected by the rodenticide. However, because they are special, we would take a sample of them into captivity in case something unexpected happened. And then just removing carcasses, like carcasses of the mice and anything else that we might find that scavengers might pick up. Next slide, please. And there would also be an extensive monitoring plan. And this monitoring actually has several aspects to it. Number one, you want to monitor the success of your operations. You want to monitor any aspects of the project that maybe are not going exactly according to plan, and make adjustments as you're going along. You also want to monitor, potential effects on the environment. And so those would be done. And you also want to look at, what the ecosystem changes are going to be after you eradicate mice. And as Pete pointed out in his talk, many of those studies have already been started. And next slide. So this brings us back to where we are now. We're still in the latter stages of our planning process. Our next phase is to go before the California Coastal Commission for a coastal consistency determination. And after that, we would get into a phase of obtaining all the many other environmental permits and consultations that we'll need, finalizing our implementation plans, and then if we're lucky, actually getting ready to implement the project maybe as soon as fall of 2022. Next slide, please. So really what this is about is restoring and safeguarding the Farallon Island ecosystem. This is an ecosystem that is out of balance because of introduced mice. We know that there is really only one effective method of removing mice from the island, and that is a one-time application of the rodenticide that we have proposed. We feel it's really important to act now. We don't want to wait until say ashy storm petrels are on the brink of extinction. And really what our goal needs to be is to make sure that we're keeping sensitive species off of the endangered species list. And next slide. And I just want to thank you all for your time and for listening. And I will hand it back over to Anna to introduce our last speaker.
Thank you so much, Gerry, for that crystal clear explanation of the restoration project. And next I present, finally, Dr. Winston Vickers. And just a reminder, folks, please do type your questions in. We'll get to as many questions as we can after Winston's talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And thanks to Gerry and Pete and Roger for those excellent presentations. It's been quite a privilege for me to work with all of them and this team and Marin Audubon that have put this program together. I'm coming at this from a bit of a different angle as a kind of an outside scientist, but someone who's had a lot of experience on all the California islands and have worked on the Farallones with this group on the hazing trials that were done out there. And I have a great deal of appreciation for the fabulous things that happen to islands when invasives are removed, because I've worked on other California islands where that's occurred. Next slide. I'm going to reiterate some of the things that have been said before, but maybe with a slightly different take. So the control issue is one versus eradication, and it can sound good to do control and just sort of reduce the impacts and not have to eradicate the mice or use poisons out there, toxins like the anticoagulant rodenticides, but it just does not accomplish the goal. There would still be declines, there would still be significant impacts. It's not practical to have a big impact on the mice through control programs. Go ahead, nice. Next slide, sorry. So my concern as a veterinarian is always with welfare of the animals, but it can be individual animals, also systems of animals. Everything is interconnected, obviously, and so doing nothing or just control has a cost, and it has a cost of delay that has broad negative welfare impacts. Next slide. One of those costs to the petrels, it can be, as was mentioned before, it can be a decline, but that's kind of a sterile term. But what that means is that they die violently in large numbers, and that's a big welfare issue. And declines can reach crisis points unexpectedly, has been mentioned, and time is not on their side. Next slide. It's worth remembering that the mice that die of starvation and hypothermia are miserable in that process. They are suffering. Their welfare is not being well served by allowing that to happen year after year after year, and that I would maintain that a one-time eradication would actually reduce the total suffering of the mouse population over time versus just having this repetitive thousands of mice starving. Next slide. And human welfare can benefit from the lack of mice, as you might imagine, working out there. Next slide. So one that's been talked about a fair amount is using contraceptives, because there's a particular product that's been licensed for rats on the mainland called Contrapest. But the issues with it are that it's short acting and has to be available to the mice indefinitely or regularly. If it's distributed in bait boxes as it's licensed to be currently, there'd have to be very large numbers of bait boxes. And managing those boxes and refilling them would be a huge task regarding going to all of them and walking, and it would be catastrophic actually for the island to have all that walking around by humans because of the burrowing birds, and it would collapse burrows and would disturb the marine mammals. So it's just not practical at all. Next slide. And even if the product was pelleted, which has been discussed a little bit by the manufacturer, the claims of non-toxicity to mice or non-targets that the manufacturer has are unproven in field settings where there would be unknown rates of uptake by the mice. And the product has two components of it that both show toxic potential at high doses, and one of them has been shown to be a carcinogen in mice. So they're just not appropriate to use on the Farallones as a research and development lab. And of course, they wouldn't accomplish eradication. It would not drive the population to zero. Next slide. Gene drive using CRISPR to alter the genes of the mice to reduce the reproductive potential has been bandied about a little bit, but again, would be unrealistic and theoretical and not developed, all kinds of ethical concerns with that. So that was rejected, but you know, it has been thrown out as an alternative. Next slide. So we know that this is toxic to small mammals and birds, it's toxic to some fish, but the mitigation measures are key that Gerry has outlined. And it's not toxic to most of the invertebrates or the plants. Next slide. It mitigates in the soil and water. I think as Gerry mentioned, basically sinks to the bottom in water. It's non-soluble, and in the soil it gets just inactive. In the soil, there's no biological way for it to emerge from the soil or the water and affect animals significantly. Next slide. So mitigation, the non-target risk, it really boils down to the birds. The pellets will become unavailable fairly shortly, either being eaten or degraded, but the hazing will minimize the exposure of birds, especially the gulls. And hazing means scaring, and all kinds of tools are used to do that, like at airports and other places where birds accumulate and threaten safety. So there are any number of tools that will be used to do that. Next slide. And to reiterate what Gerry said, only 1.6 ounces of the ingredient will be dropped on the island. And in comparison, for those counties that are nearby, in 2017, which is the last year I was able to get data, 39,000 pounds over that were dropped in bait on the mainland, containing 27 ounces of active ingredient of the three related second generation products. Next slide. And if you dropped, someone had asked, well, what if it all got dumped in the ocean instead, accidentally? Well, that would be 1.6 ounces of the active ingredient dropped in the ocean off the Farallones, and I just did the calculation to find out how much water that is, even if it's all swept toward the mainland in a mass, it would be diluted in 4 billion gallons of water. So I don't think that's a big concern. Next slide. There we go. And reiterating that on Anacapa, the eradication using the same compound had minimal gull impacts, and there was no fish or crab residues that were detected after that. And it's worth noting that International Bird Rescue, who supports the project, had stated that they've never seen a gull with anticoagulant rodenticide toxicity over the decades on the mainland, despite all the products that have been used there. So it's at least a little bit hopeful based on that. Next slide. So the bottom line, the welfare of the gulls and the mice, the whole system will benefit, has been taken into account that only eradication will accomplish the goal, and rodenticides are the only proven method, and contraceptive and gene manipulation are not realistic options, and there's no threat to the coast from the product. Next slide. We have this future vision. I'll reiterate that Refuge restored with the last non-natives can just bloom, and many other islands have, including islands in California. The native vegetation will thrive, and the Farallones ecosystem can return to a balance with resiliency because there are stressors on the way and occurring now, like climate change. That's my last slide, and thank you very much for your attention. Back to Anna.
Thank you so much, Winston, for that very thorough review. We have dozens of questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. We'll go a few minutes over. I do want to say, though, first that each of you who registered will be getting a follow-up email with a link to this recording that you may share with anyone. So that was one of the questions, several of the questions in the queue. Again, could we get to the slide with the link to the where people can find that? There you go. Yeah, to send a letter of support for the project to the Coastal Commission. You'll see there on the slide. You can take that down. So with no further ado, we'll get started with some questions. We've got 62 questions in the queue, so we won't get to them all. We've tried to group some. So I think I'll start with Roger. Why does the California Coastal Commission have jurisdiction over this federal project, state agency? And what reservations would the commissioners have about approving this project, and who's opposed to this project?
Okay, so the project is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service project. And however, the Coastal Commission has jurisdiction over the waters. And so they have to make a consistency determination that the project proposed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is consistent with the California Coastal Act. The commission will be having a hearing on the project we think in November, but they previously had a hearing. And for that hearing, the Coastal Commission staff did a thorough study of the project and came out 100% in favor of the project. And we don't know what will come out in November because the staff report has not yet been developed for that period. But the Coastal Commission itself is made up of political appointees. So it's a little bit more of a political process, we think, because they're not really scientists. They have access to science, but they aren't scientists themselves. In terms of the opposition, I'm glad that question was asked because I was very anxious to read as much as I could about the people who opposed to the project, because my loyalty was not to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but to the island itself and to the wildlife there. So if there were problems out there, I wanted to hear about them. And I think there are two very legitimate issues that the opposition bring up. There's a number of issues which I think are kind of red herrings, like the current administration in Washington is in favor of this. Probably not the case. The project started in 2004, way before the current occupant was in the White House. But I think there are two legitimate issues. And those I think you have to balance. One is lethal take. There will be lethal take not only of mice, but there'll be some incidental take, probably of some gulls. A very low number, we think, but there will be some take of gulls as well. And if you're opposed to any take, then that you might be opposed to this, the project. Those of us who are in favor of the restoration feel that on balance, the life that would be saved by eradicating the mice is greater than the few animals that might be sacrificed by lethal take. The other issue is a very big issue, and that is the use of rodenticide. And the feeling is from many people in the opposition that rodenticide is just not the right thing to use, and that under no circumstances can you use rodenticide. For those of us who are supporting this project, we feel that the one-time use of rodenticide on the island is acceptable, and it's quite different from the chronic use of rodenticide on the mainland. But those, I think those are the two big issues that, for those of you who are weighing pro and con, I think those are the two issues you need to weigh in on.
Thank you, Roger. I have a question. Several people had this question, which I'll direct to Gerry McChesney. How is a rodenticide actually applied, and how will it be kept out of the marine environment?
Yeah, I apologize if I didn't make that clear in my presentation, and I guess I did not. The rodenticide would be applied from the air using a helicopter that would have the bait in a specially designed bait bucket that distributes the bait where it's needed along a series of transects. And the design of the aerial bait application is designed as such so that you're keeping the baiting above the high tide line so that you're not baiting the marine environment. And that's not to say that there will be no bait whatsoever that will go into the marine environment. We recognize that there will be some small amount of bait drift, but other eradication projects have shown with all of the planning that goes into these, that the amount of bait drift is very small. And for example, studies at Anacapa Island found no impacts whatsoever on the marine environment there. And that was what we would incorporate into the plan for the Farallones.
Thank you, Gerry. The next question, which also is asked by numerous people, I'm directing to Pete. So, are the mice also on surrounding islets that can escape eradication? How will new invasions be prevented? And how do we know that this project will kill all the mice and be successful?
Okay, well, that's 3 questions. I'll do my best. So first off, mice are on the major islands in the South Farallon Islands. So the biggest one, Southeast Farallon, West End, and possibly one of the larger islets, but are not known to be on the smaller little rocks and offshore islets. So they're basically just on the larger of the islands. Eradications like this have proven very successful at removing all of the invasive mammals, mice or rats, whatever the target is, on islands in the past. And the key to that is being able to spread the bait over most of the surface of the island so that every mouse has access to it. So if you're doing this aerial broadcast, then you can get bait into every single mouse territory. And that's what gives you that success of making sure you get every mouse in 1 or 2 applications of the bait. Finally, what was the third part? How will we prevent reintroduction of mice?
Yeah.
So this is a project that Fish and Wildlife is working on. And Gerry might be better to answer this, but I can say that there are what are called biocontainment protocols that will be instituted to help make sure that they don't, and that it involves changing the way we do operations coming and going to the island, using packaging to make sure that it's rodent proof when we're bringing anything out there, checking boats that are coming to the island, things like that to prevent reintroduction. And there are methods for those outlined in the response and follow-up monitoring plans that Fish and Wildlife is developing.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as part of the our environmental impact statement. Part of that has a biosecurity plan that is in the environmental impact statement that lays out the plan to ensure that we're not reintroducing things to the island. I mean, you can't have these projects and then be reintroducing the rodents back onto the island. So that goes into packaging and making sure the boats that are bringing out supplies to the island are rodent free, making sure where we're storing our supplies are rodent free. So we already have a lot of biosecurity in place now with how we package up supplies that are coming out to the island, but that would be stepped up considerably once the mouse eradication project is done.
Great. We're going to take one more question. We have time for one more question, going over a few minutes. And this is directed to Gerry and perhaps others regarding raptors and vultures. So how will this project protect raptors like hawks, and won't turkey vultures be attracted to the mouse carcasses on the island and be poisoned?
I'm happy to take that. So as I mentioned in my presentation, a big part of our mitigation plan is making sure that raptors are not exposed. They could, say for example, if burrowing owls were left on the island, they would almost certainly feed on mice that had been exposed to the rodenticide, and then they would be affected, and we don't want that to happen. And we would follow the same protocols that have been done, say on Anacapa Island and other island rodent eradication projects, where before you start the project, you capture as many of those individuals as you can. You bring them in captivity, either taking them to the mainland or even holding them in captivity until harm is over. So that's how we would address that. And as far as something like turkey vultures getting out to the island, I think maybe only a couple of records for turkey vulture in total at the Farallones. We almost never see them. Very few scavenging birds besides the gulls that are already out there. And given the fact that the majority of the mice will die underground, where they're not even going to be available to scavengers, I think, the chances of anything else coming out there to feed on them besides the occasional, individuals that might come by is very small.
Thanks, Gerry. Well, we still have over 76 questions unanswered, so apologize for that, folks, but thank you so much for your interest in asking questions. And I'm now going to hand the mic over to Barbara Salzman from Marin Audubon to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Barbara, for organizing this.
Well, I'm certainly glad that we did. It started out being a small program for our regular monthly programs, and I'm so pleased that it developed into this. And in closing, I want to say that it's very clear from all of these presentations that this plan is well thought out and comprehensively studied, and there can be no doubt that it's going to be effective. There have been claims that it's a rush to action, and clearly that's not the case. The major decision pending, which was in one of our communications, is what was said before, the Coastal Commission's decision on the consistency of the plan with the California Coastal Zone Management Program. Their basic goal is protecting, enhancing, and restoring the coastal resources. So if everybody just wrote a letter and said that, it would be wonderful. And so we urge you to take action. And we're going to be putting information on our website too about how to communicate and some suggestions about points to say. And so I want to say, ending, a huge thank you to our panelists. It's been a very informative and just impressive program. And I'm sure you feel like I do, like I learned an incredible amount. So a special thank to you, to all the panelists, including Anna, who's done a great job. And I can't say enough for Point Blue. A huge thank you to them, because this program wouldn't be possible if they hadn't provided technical and all sorts of other support. So thank you to all, and we look forward to you communicating with the Coastal Commission. Please communicate with me, and I'm sure Point Blue, with some of your questions that remain, and we'll try to answer for you. Thank you for coming.